Professor Lu is a chair professor of the biostatistics in the Department of the Biomedical Data Science at Stanford University, also currently in the Department of Radiology and Epidemiology with the populational health in the USA. He also was a professor at the University of California, San Francisco, and he was finished the PhD in the biostatistics from University of California, Berkeley. So let's give the floor. Today is Professor Lu will talk about the composite endpoint for treatment benefit according to patient preference. Let's give the floor to Professor Lu.
Thank you, Shim, for the invitation, and really glad to have opportunity to share research work and also hear your feedback and to make work more improved. And so I just want first of all make sure that you can see the slides okay and hearing my voice okay.
Yes.
Okay, good. So today I'm going to share some work about the research in my let's see, how do I move? Okay, just give me 1 minute, trying to see how to move the not moving. Okay. Okay. So today I'm going to share some of my work in the area about endpoints in clinical trials. And we know the clinical trials is the way to test the medications or interventions and maybe compare the procedures, whether they work or not. And so the endpoint is the critical way to compare the two interventions or multiple interventions. And there are, standard ways to do that, but sometimes because of clinical questions may be different. So you want to change the endpoints to improve the clinical trial efficiency and make the trial more relevant. And so here, I just listed some of the work that I finished recently on the endpoint for clinical trials, including joint inferences. That's the same endpoint, but you have a population and subgroup. You want to make inference simultaneously. And there's also about survival analysis instead of using Cox proportional hazards, looking for restricted mean survival time. And so like for ALS or many other diseases, you have functional longitudinal endpoints and survival endpoints. So the joint modeling can improve their efficiency. And also surrogate endpoints, how to evaluate surrogate endpoints in the early phase trials. And my focus more not only on the surrogate endpoints, but what's impact on the design. So this, what's really the benefit for surrogate endpoints. And the lastly, but not, I worked on a patient-centered approach recently. And there are two papers. One is under review for almost a year now. The other one has been published in the clinical journals. So that's the one I want to share with you today. I think there's some issue. Okay, here. So here's the outline. So I give some kind of basic concept about patient-centered approach and relevance to the trial. And I talk about integrate patient preference in the outcome measures. And then the clinical trials that using that kind of endpoints. And I compare the operational characteristics with conventional approaches through simulation study. And also, I talk a little bit about extend the idea to the observational studies, and finally give some comments. So we know that healthcare traditionally centered around professionals and physicians, and therefore, as a result, medical research is traditionally driven by clinicians and research scientists. So in my personal experience, maybe about, we're talking about maybe 7-8 years ago, at Stanford, we planned a patient-centered approach trial for the cognitive behavior intervention versus usual care for multiple sclerosis patients. And we want to make sure that the cognitive behavior therapy can help managing their most relevant symptoms. So the planning of the study is starting with the primary endpoint of chronic pain measured by, PROMIS pain score. That's one of the US NIH developed the score, standardized score for the pain. So while we are planning the trial and writing the grant, we had the opportunity to link the internet through the patient advocate. So we did a survey, ask patients, what are the most important clinical outcome for them? So when we received the input, almost 60% of patients say the fatigue is the one they want to address. 29% is pain, and about 12% for depression. So basically, if we do successfully control the pain, which is good, but we may not address the concerns for the 70% of patients. Of course, people may argue that pain may be the cause of fatigue and depression, but still, in terms of clinical trial endpoints, we kind of miss the majority of them. The endpoint that majority patients cares. So this get back to the center view, the patient-centered approach for healthcare is really want to take patient input and understand their questions and find solutions for the patients. So that way, we want to listen to their needs and put their need into our trial design. So we want to design a study according to what patients want, what they need, and what they preferred, okay? And so we want to make sure that comparison treatment will consider their input. And the benefit also, the conclusion of the trial will be relevant. The results will be relevant to their care and their decision-making. There are multiple ways to do the patient-centered trials, like pragmatic trials, real-world studies emphasize on the patient-reported outcomes, and also a lot of comparative effectiveness trials. So the key point here, if we integrate their input into the endpoint, that the patient-centered endpoint can apply to all these approaches. We just want to make sure that we also not ignore the considerations from stakeholders such as physicians, regulatory agencies, and policymakers. But this talk will focus on how to integrate patient concerns, preference into the trial endpoint. So here I give a little background about the ALS, which is a neuron disease in the motor neuron. And so ALS is a very rare disease, but they have extremely poor prognosis. Average, I think majority of patients die within 3 to 5 years after the diagnosis. And the ALS affect multiple domains, including bulbar, arm, leg, and the respiratory functions. And so to measure the disease progress and measure the impact of disease, there is a functional score called ALS RS. The last R is a revision, I think, functional standardized functional rate score. So this is a validated instruments for the patient-reported disease status and outcome. And so patients basically score their functional status in about 4 domains, and then all their scores add up to be a total score. So this has been used as a gold standard for clinical trials and to evaluate benefit for the intervention for the ALS. So last year, we did a very quick survey through a Netherlands ALS population-based registry. And so there's we asked patients, so if we do a trial and we report ALSR, which one is most relevant to them? Is that total scores? So one of the 4 domain scores. So we asked them to rank not just the 1, but all the 4 in the rank order, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we allow them to have a tire. In other words, I think functional BOBA are equally important, respiratory are equally important, but not the leg or arm, for example. So we did the survey in actually 4 weeks, I believe. It was amazingly interest from patients. I think we reached out 668 living patients in Netherlands registry, and we received response from 500 of them say they want to join the survey. And at the end, we got 433 completed questionnaire response. So this is a very involved patient population. So from there, we can see that most patients really concern more beyond total score. So here is when we say all equal, we just say they don't differentiate the subdomains. So the most important is the total score. So this is about 30-some percentage, 38%. But there are 62% of the patients have preference. For example, this one, respiratory is the number 1 concern, BOBA is number 2, fine motor is number 3, and the growth is number 4. So that's the second, about 10% of patients. But you can see some of the group are very small. For example, fine motor is more important for them, BOBA, growth, and the respiratory. So you can see there's a huge heterogeneity in terms of patients' concerns about what is important to them as let me see, and move this. Okay, what is important to them. And so we need to integrate that heterogeneity into our clinical trial consideration. So here we did compare what are influence for their preference. We look for the most important domain versus their clinical assessment most affected the domain. There is some consistency there. You can see the diagonal is the highest percentage, but off diagonal still, there are quite a lot of patients off diagonal. For example, more patients concerned about respiratory, regardless their most affected domain, because respiratory is really the leading cause for the death, right? And also, we checked for their domain of disease onset with the signal, and that one was relatively weak in terms of signaling. You can see the consistency is not that strong when they started the disease. So nonetheless, this is just give us the hint that there's a huge heterogeneity among the patients. So the question here is, how do we compare them? Of course, we can compare their total score, but that one did not consider the variations, different perspective about patients. And because the perspective really depends on the patient's culture and the personal situation. And so therefore, it's not uniformly control that, right? So you have to consider both reflect the patient preference. So if the two patients have the same order of preference, and that's relatively simple. So we just compare, look for the variable according to the ranks. As long as the top rank win, we consider the patient treatment benefit. This patient has better outcome than the other one. The problem, the second case is that if one patient have uniformly better outcome than another patient, in that case, the difference in the preference does not matter. So this patient say, I prefer A, the other patient, I prefer B, but the patient one have both A and B better than patient two. So we think that patient A one still be better, right? Regardless their preference. So really trick here is that if the patient have different preferences, but they are not uniformly better. in that case, how do we compare? So there are different ways to compare them. One way is to compare the one outcome that affect most of patients. Like in our case, 38% patients report the total score is the best approach. So we using that regardless the difference. And so it's not really personalized. And then the other way you can do is compare total score, then you can compare also 4 subdomains. That's what we usually do. We have primary endpoints, we have secondary endpoints. So there is issue about multiple comparison here, and statistically maybe not efficient. And you can also do a linear combination of the outcome based on the top rank. So this one really, you regenerate a different total score for the population, right? But still, that's not really reflect the second level or lower level difference. So here is the new approach we proposed here. And so first of all, we look for the common top ranking set. So the patient 1 and patient 2 in this case, they have top common set is B, but second common top set is BGR, because the first 2 is B, it's the same. BG and BR is not the same. But the second level, oh yeah, so it's is BGR for the first one, is the second patient is BRG. So these 2 sets are common. So we compare when we identify from the smallest common set to the largest, to grow to the next common set, when we compare their outcome within the common set. So if in the common set, patient A is uniformly better than patient B, and there's no question that patient A has better outcome than patient B. However, if the patient A have a not consistent, so they are tied, then you can go to next phase to say second page common sets and to break the tie until you get the whole the whole set. So the largest common set is all the dimensional variables. And if you still cannot break the tie, then you basically say they tied. So this is the very simple idea what we propose here. So mathematically, you can think about, we have a K endpoints as a vector. And then for each pair of patient A and B, we assume their outcomes can be compared for the marginal outcomes. So each sub-outcome, they are comparable. And then in that case, we can derive the win for each marginal outcome because that's simply one-dimensional case. So this case, if patient I is better than patient J in that outcome, we put the ZIJ. So this is the I patient and J patient comparable for the case dimensional outcome is 1. Otherwise, it's 0. So there's cases that you cannot compare them. So they tied, they get 0.05 in that case. And then, well, we ask patients to report their outcome. We also ask to rank the importance to them. So they ranked RI1, which may be RI2 and RIK. And this one, if we don't allow tie, this becomes a multinomial distribution with all possible K factorial possibilities. So this become one unit multivariate. And then from this rank, we can grow, which is the first top one, right? The 1 is the first set. So the patient I have the first set, that would be the variable of the rank, you choose at the rank. And so we can grow this, the top ranking sets. And then if you have I and J, 2 patients, and we can decide which one are the common sets. So the first one is the minimum common set. The last one is the largest common set, which is including all patients, all outcomes. So by doing that, we can say if a patient I is better than J, that basically they're existing one of the common set that all the marginal K is greater than 0. And also, so in other words, none of the marginal is worse, but the maximum marginal is better, okay? So for that subset of endpoints, the maximum has break than 1, so this is 1. And the similar idea, if there's one of them is worse, but the rest of them is not better, then they are the 2. So if you cannot find such a subset, common subset, then basically they are tied. So in that case, they are either minimum, maximum, or equal to 0, which means all the dimensions are tied, or some of them have the 0, minimum 0, and the maximum is 1. So they have discordant results for the common preference. So you cannot really break the tie. So that's the basic mathematical framework. And algorithm-wise, you can do iteratively, looking for the subset. And once they are common set, then you do this kind of, a minimum, maximum of the Z, and to determine the results. So any questions so far?
No, I'm fine.
Okay, thank you. So the basic concept is pretty straightforward. And what we do here is including them into the clinical trial setting. So here we consider 2-arm randomized controlled clinical trial. And so we put T as treatment indicator, and the 1 is the treatment arm, and 0 is the control arm. And then NT is the number of patients assigned to the treatment, so they can be different. And we added the superscription of T to indicate treatment assignment, and also for the preference. So in here, we're really comparing the patients between 2 treatment arms. And so I is from treatment control arm, and the J is from treatment arm. So for back to our CBT trial, which we proposed here, we assume these variables are normalized and follow the standardized score. So they follow the normal distribution. And it's multivariate normal distribution. And the ranking, because there are 3 outcomes: fatigue, pain, and depression. So we get 6-dimensional, 6 multinomial distribution. And then for this one, there's a little bit trick in terms of the difference between two scores. And there's a minimum clinically relevant difference. And so that one for the dimension for the fatigue is 0.67. So it's quite large in terms of standard deviation. And the second one is 0.63, and the last one is 0.54. So in other words, if the difference is less than that, it's not considered important. So for this one, we can do the marginal difference. If the difference between 2 patients are more than the minimum important difference, then in this case, treatment winning over the control. If less than that, treatment is worse than control. If within that, they tied. So by doing that, we can derive this pain score. So I think for the time, I skipped that, but this just gives some examples for the same set of clinical outcome. When you have different ranking systems, different preference, you may result into a different conclusion. Even clinical endpoints are the same. Okay, so I skipped that one. And so once we have that, then everything becomes much easier. So we can put the winning rate or winning probability for this overall. Once we can rank, we can create winning probability for the overall comparison, which is basically expected value of the Zij. And then, in that case, because these 2 are exchangeable, so if treatment doesn't work, we expect the winning probability to be 0.05. And if treatment works better, then we expect the winning probability should be higher than 0.05. Otherwise, will be less. So this is the idea that has been proposed in 2016 or 2017 by Evans and another co-work called the DOOR, degree of desirability rating. So that's a door approach that being more adaptive in the clinical trial community. And similarly, we can define the door for marginal for each individual outcomes. So theta K is the same winning rate for the sub covariate. So we can do, when there's two-dimensional, we can actually prove that the overall joint winning probability is a linear average of the two marginal probability, which is the preference rate and the probability. But there are plus two terms. These two terms are the tires. So when one variable tire, the first outcome is tired, and what are the chances that second outcome actually preferred? And similarly, the second outcome is tied. What is the chance of first outcome preferred? So very nicely, if there's no tie, in other words, if your outcome is continuous variable, then your joint score is actually the average of two marginal score. And this is very appealing because this just shows if there is no tie, and if you have continuous variable, and then your winning probability overall does not depend on the correlation between first outcome and second outcome. It's very simple. And so that's comfortable about, the reason, it is reasonable endpoints. Now, the problem here is that we don't know what happened for more than two endpoints. It's very messy, and we couldn't prove any nice, simple structure that joint is the sum of the marginal plus something. But at least for two-dimensional. So this shows if I do a stratified analysis, so I only look for the first group of patients who prefer the first endpoint, and we derive their preference. And second group, then I can do a stratified variable, by average them, I get the same result as the joint. So that's a very nice piece property. So to estimate the winning probability for the trial, basically we do this Hofding test. So we select everyone from the treatment control arm and everyone from treatment arm. We calculate their ZIJ, then we average them across. And so this expected value is consistent. And also when you get large sample, this really follow the normal with known variance. And for people who familiar with ROC curve, and this is not very different. So you understand this is just basically area under the ROC curve, test the statistics, and everything is the same. And so you can do tests, and the variance can be estimated by the moment function. And this cross, so that basically the same patient, if they compare I and J, so the patient can compare two, one patient in the control arm can compare two in the treatment arm. Therefore, they build a correlation the same way that one treated patient may compare two control patients, so there's correlation. If the pairs are completely different, then they are independent. So that's how you can derive this variance pretty easily. And we can also derive the sample size formula. So this is very much similar to the ROC curves. Now, one thing I want to mention here, when you look for this variance and covariance, you don't see the preference in there, but you also don't see the variance of outcome variables. Everything's built in this ZIJ. So it's not explicit, but it's naturally embedded. So here we go back to our CBT example. And so we have, if we consider the treatment arm that all the dimensions uniformly improved. So in other words, all the endpoints have one standard deviation improvement. And so we do this is the literature reporting for the covariance of this promise scale of depression, pain, and fatigue. So if this is the covariance of the normal distribution, and this is the reported preference from the patients, and if we do 1-to-1 randomization, and so our winning probability is 0.78. So 78% of time that the pair of the patients will in favor of treatment. And then we can derive the variance and the sample size derivations, 12 patients per arm, total 24 patients for a type 1 error, two-sided 0.05 and the power 90%. So you can plan study accordingly. And this can extend for more different kind of endpoints. So I want to show example here. If we talk about survival endpoints, so if I do some kind of chemotherapy, which is very toxic, so I improve patient survival from 40% to 60%. So this is a hypothetical. I mean, it's a really amazing improvement. And so assuming the survival function follow exponential distribution, and then because of the toxicity relevant to the treatment, so the proportion among the survival time, the patient in the maybe nursing home or poor quality of life is 50% of the survival time versus 29% in the control arm. Oh, the quality of life time is 50%, 55% of time in the control, 29% in the treatment. So in other words, you live longer, but you don't have longer quality of life. And so there's a trade-off, basically, that this is the quality of lifetime, which is a minimum of the proportion of 1 times the overall survival time. And we create a random log normal distribution for this proportion. And so we censored the 10% of patients at 1 year at the trial. And so you can see this, the basically survival curve between treatment arm and control arm. These are the proportion of the time that actually quality of life, the second proportion of good quality of life among the lifetime. And if we have this scenario, then our endpoint become survival time or sensor time and the survival indicator. And there you can still rank between the two. And so the marginal ranking, we use a Gihan's ranking. Basically, if they, if we have a definitive, if the treatment, so this way is a treatment follow-up time is longer than the control time, and the control patient died, then you get 1. Otherwise, the same way. So this is relevant because the quality of life is very much, the view of the quality of life is very much culturally sensitive and depends on the person. So some patient may prefer more quality of life than overall life, right? So it depends on the population. Here's a break-even point. If the 50% winning point, then if 20% of patients, rank the quality of life more than the overall survival more than the quality of life, then you can see the intervention is beneficial. But if less than 20% patients ranked overall life, if the 80% patients rank OS, 20% patients rank OS over quality disease, toxicity-free survival, then actually treatment is not good because you harm more. So that's kind of thing that shows the idea how to incorporate into different endpoints. And so we did the reviewer asked us to do the performance comparison for operating characteristics. The one concern here is that, what's the impact of preference on the trial endpoints? And secondly, what interaction may have. So we did in the revision, we did a kind of extensive simulation studies and to compare this composite endpoint with 4 other approaches. So the simulation is based on the example 1 of the CBT trial, and randomization rate is 1-to-1, and we put trial sample size of 60 patients. We repeated the experiment 2,000 times. And so here's the scenario that we compare. So in the null hypothesis, you have usual care, which means 0, and the patient may rank differently, the first, second, 1, 2, 3, 1, 3, 2, and this is the ranking order. And we have two scenarios of the distribution of ranking order. The first scenario is unequal preference based on the survey. So the first group, you get 42 ranking, and as you go to the last one is 0.03. So in other words, the third endpoint is most important, this second, and this fatigue. So it's complete opposite population rate. This rate is only 4% of the patients. And second scenario is equal. So patients really don't know which they like. I mean, either they don't know which they like, so they randomly choose the importance, or this actually, they really think they are equally important. So it doesn't matter. Okay, so we get second set. And so here scenario, we have 7 scenarios. The first scenario is the non-hypothesis, right? There's no difference. So theoretically, the winning probability is 0.05, regardless what the preference would be. The second case is all the variable increasing to 1 dimension. So in that case, unequal preference and the equal preference should be very similar because it should unifiedly improved. The minor little difference is actually because we have different size of minimum important difference. So that's a fact. So in other words, because third variable has smallest minimal important difference, so they break time more often. So that reflects the unequal probability that's slightly high. So these are theoretical value by large Monte Carlo calculation. And the third and the 4 are 2 cases that if we choose the most important endpoints as my primary concern, so improve 1 unit, and also the least popular endpoint improve 1 unit. So this should impact on unequal preference more, but if you have equal preference, they should be the same. Again, the third variable have smaller minimum difference. So these are theoretical value. The last 3 sets is one scenario that its impact on the 2 endpoints. So first one is, you impact most popular one and the least popular one, but least popular one, you get 0.5%. So there's no interaction. And so that's why it's better than increasing one variable, but worse than the uniformly improvement. However, the 6 and 7 are the interaction case. So this one, it's improved in the most popular, the first top ranking 2 endpoints. And the last one is improving the least popular endpoints. So the least popular endpoint improve 1, the second is 0.05. This was the most popular is 1, the second is 0.05. So this is the represent the chance when the patient report concern are the one that you have much more room to improve. So more likely you get improvement in this area. The last case is that the popular one are the chronic disease that it's really difficult to improve. So your treatment will not work. So this is the worst case. And so you can see the impact here by the choice of preference. So the comparison we did, we have 4 methods. One's univariate approach. So here we put all the 3 variables as a univariate, depending on your choice, right? So we put there. And the second one is multiple endpoints. So I look for all 3 endpoints simultaneously, but I use the closed procedure to control family-wise type 1 error rates. So here, when n equal to 3, we use bound-from-the-home, which is the CTP approach. The third one is called aggregated ranking. This is proposed by the reviewer. So basically, you rank your first variable, and you rank the second variable and third variable of patient in the whole trial population, right? And then you put the weight by their top preference, P1, P2, P3, and this will be aggregated ranking. And so this is really individual. So the first 2 does not impact by patient preference, but this one does because at least for top level of the ranking. And so you average this ranking, then you do a well-cotton test. So that the second one is called weighted average for stratified winning probability. So the idea is that you actually, what we do here is stratification of patients. So you can do the winning probability for each strata, and then you aggregate by their proportion in the population. So if for the n equal to 2, k equal to 2 without tied, well, that's equal to the overall winning probability. When you get higher dimensions, it's getting more complicated, or higher number of outcomes. This one turned out to be pretty difficult because some of the strata can be very small, so that they cannot generate winning probability. And then there's the aggregate become difficult. So that's the case. So here shows some results. First of all, we show the estimates are consistent in all the scenarios, regardless equal or unequal preference. So that's a pretty comfort for this sample size. And the standard deviation is pretty reasonable and consistent, much more consistent than endpoint. Second one, we looked at type 1 error rates. And so this one's under the norm, and notice that the scale is from 2% to 7%, 8%. And for the sample size of 60, we know Hoffman test is more liberal. And the reason of that is it's compared the treatment and the control arm. So you only have the pair between treatment and control. You don't have the pairs within treatment and within control arms. So its convergency to the normal is lower than the Mann-Whitney test. And so the simulation shows you need to get maybe sample size of 100 to get smooth curve. And this is the same for all to get correct type 1 error. So 60%, we expect the higher type 1 error rates, but it's not too high. And again, the impact of type 1 error rate is less for the equal preference than unequal preference. But it's consistent with the marginal endpoints. And so the one that here is the family-wise one. So the mainly control for non-hypothesis first one, second one, third one, 1, 2, 1, 3, 2, 3, and overall. So when you get overall hypothesis, type 1 error rates are similar to that. So the aggregated ranking and weighted is the one that really closest for the 0.05 level. And so in terms of power, if we have uniformly improvement, so this scale is 95 to 100. So even the show difference actually is very small difference in terms of numerical value. So if uniform improvement, we can see that equal and equal perform very equally, subject to some random variation. And so that's peace of mind that, it's not really driven by the choice of patients if, the treatment's uniformly better than the other one. I think that was one of the main concerns from the reviewer, that if I have a good treatment because patient preference different, I will get dinged from regulatory agencies say your drug is not good, right? So the problem here is if they get different ones, then really the importance of the patient preference become important. So this one just show the power and type 1 error rates for improve the most important endpoints, at least important endpoints, and also in terms of their priority. And so you can see that if it's improved most important endpoints and unequal preference actually reflects that patient preference, so it's much more efficient than the equal preference, because the other variables are not improved, right? And so overall, however, if the least important variable being impacted, then equal preference has more power than the have more power than unequal, because unequal weight the least important variable less. And if you do the Univariate, it's really reflects which variable you use. If you choose the right variable, it's become more powerful. But the question here is, individual variable may not reflect overall benefit, right? So this is expected. And the close inference is the same situation. So if you're including the right variables, it's to get more powerful. However, it's hard to reflect in terms of patient preference individually. So the aggregated variable and the weighted stratified variable is quite similar to DOR, except, it's very similar to DOR. And so they reflect somehow the same natural patient preference. The only thing is that when they have the least important variable and they may be even under equal, they still perform less powerful. So the last one's most interesting about interactions. So without interaction versus interaction, it shows that with interaction, the DOR is still way better than the AI and the weighted stratified. So that's the signal, and it's robust. So we kind of finished the results for the trial, and now I move to the using that to the observational studies. So the idea here is that now if we have a cohort of patients from 1 to I, and so for each pair of patients within the cohort, we can derive their winning for the Zij. So a Zi versus the rest of patient. Then we say if there are another patient of yourself, that's Thai, of course. So we can average this to get kind of a weight, W score for this patient in the population. So the meaning of W, you can see, is the probability of that patient compared to the rest in the, what's the probability of the particular patient I is better than anyone that you randomly choose from population. So that's the meaning of that. So if it's very low, which means this patient is very in a poor outcome, it's very high, which means it's much better than the rest of patients, right? So this WI is in the right scale. And then we can rank WI then using as the rank. And so this way you can actually do a Wilcoxon-Rankin test, or you can associate. So for observational study, we can do a correlation of the rank with exposure variable, for example. So here's one example. So this one that we did 443 patients with the ranking in the ALS registry in our survey study. So on this scale is the ranking based on our proof. I just explained. So this scale here is their total score. And now you can see they are not linear, right? There's some curvature here. So that shows the ranking, proof-based ranking. Proof, I need to say what proof means. It's patient preferred outcome. Patient prefer the order of functional scale, okay? So that's how we call the proof. And so you can see it's not linear, basically, right? So there's some kind of curvature here, which means the rankings really reflect differently than the total score itself. And so what we can say that, so we can do Spearman's correlation of WI and with some kind of clinical interesting covariates. And also we can compare exposure using Mann-Whitney test statistics, okay? So here is one example. So when the ALS patient's disease onset, okay, they have a bulba, which means the respiratory, I think the respiratory or the fine eating area was the first one that they noticed. And versus the rest part, it can be leg, spine, arm, so as the way that identified. So the epidemiology data has been shown in the ALS patients, bulbar patients progress much faster than the spinal patients. And this is known, and about 25% patients diagnosed with bulbar. In our registry ALS, there's 17% that responders in the bulbar. And remember, this is cross-sectional data of living ALS in Netherlands. So if we look for total score and the median are perfect identical, basically these two groups of patients are very similar. However, if we put in this winning probability, we put the proof, we put their ranking of preference into their score and modify the ranking. And we start to show the difference that bulbar patients actually more likely to be poor than the patients with spinal onset. And actually the difference was significant, 0.028. So this is kind of give us comfort that this variable maybe reflect something that important to the patients and indirectly observed from epidemiology data, but not missed in the aggregated averages score. So these are the main results that I presented. I want to do a quick discussion so we have some time to talk, to hear your comments. So this is a patient-centric approach. We really important to recognize and incorporate the different values from patients. And the variation of preference, choice, and outcome variables are combined together in this composite endpoints. So as the results, the similar numerical outcomes may mean different to the patients, and all variable actually reflect in the right direction that for the patient preference. So our approach is non-parametric, and you can using all kind of mixed survival, endpoint, continued, categorical, as long as univariate, each outcome can be compared. And we also allow for minimal significant difference. I think that's important for clinical meaningful change. And after we publish the clinical paper in the ALS journal, we get a commentary paper. The question really like this, but they have a question how to specify effect size. This is kind of tricky because it's not directly translation. So 10% improve is quite a lot. It's different from ROC curve that 0.05 to 0.6 is not really much. But in clinically, if 10% patient improve preference, that may be significant. And there are also in the statistics journal, there are a lot of questions about the generalizability of the results. And the only thing that we can answer is the same as all the trials. The generalizability rely on the representativeness of your enrolled patients to the target population. So if the preference is representative, then your results valid. So in clinical trial, we trying to do a pre-randomization determination of preference, but it's not necessary. The key part here is the outcome variables. The preference will not depending on outcome that you're going to evaluate. So the simple way stratification randomization to ensure it will be achieve that goal. And population stratification versus, so there's also, we can do high level population stratification instead of patient preference. And we show when there's interactions between preference and patient outcome, the door is much more effective. And so we can also using that into epidemiology studies. And so one question here in epidemiology studies, there may be some reverse causality that, so how to avoid reverse causality in the patient ranking versus their actual value outcome. So you need to do very carefully analyze the data. We only give this an idea. We're working much harder on this direction. So I want to show that FDA actually in the US start to open using patient reported outcome. So recently in the past when FDA approved for the migraine drug, they asked for the co-primary endpoints of the pain and also the not only the pain, but also they want to demonstrate the reduction in the three associated symptoms: nausea, photophobia, and phonophobia. And the problem here, not patients experience all these events, right? Some patients experience nausea, some patients experience the phobia. So this will dilute the efficiency of the trial because they have no improvement. They never bother them. So FDA now, the new guideline law, what they call the patient identify the most bothersome migraine-associated symptom. So in that way, they get, instead of 3 co-primary endpoint, they use 1 endpoint. So it's very similar to us, except we can ask them to ranking the 3 symptoms importance instead of single most importance. And so we have our package available for sample size calculation. And also we have Shine app for the ALS disease to, if you put patient's value, they calculate the ranking order for you. So the future work, there will continue on the ALS survey data and ALS trials. We're doing also quality of life study survey and also reproducibility, longitudinal change in the second wave of survey. We ask data for the migraine trial data and see if we can share lights to see add additional ranking will help for. And we want to work more different type of data, like longitudinal data. And also we want to understand imputation effect on this kind of analysis. And the people ask if, we have categorical ranking. They say if we don't have categorical ranking of all variables, but say I have 50% of preference of this, that, how do you compare? So it's become non-stratified variable. And so maybe the Bayesian is somewhere will help us in that case. And we want the other part, of course, in the trial, we do sequential adaptive trial design. So how to incorporate, how to do that for this kind of endpoints, and also causal inference for observational studies. So this is something we are doing. So before end, I want recognize contributions for my colleagues. Ruben is a visiting scholar at Stanford from Netherlands, and we collaborate on the ALS. And he brings this to the ALS much faster than I cooked this for many years, sitting on that. Ying is an MS student, and there are several visiting scholars in my department and at different stage work on this. And Lu Tian is my colleague. Xingming is a professor at the UC San Diego. Jay is from Merck originally. They provide some funding and collaboration. Nelson is epidemiologist on neuroepidemiology. So this is really collaboration among all of us. And I really like to hear your questions. Sorry to take all the time.
Yeah, it's firstly, thank you, Professor Lu, from the other side of the world, to give this fantastic talk about new methodology to compare the endpoint and incorporating with the patient's opinions, preference, rather than a clinical base alone. And so it's time for question. And Antonio, if you have questions, just either put a hand up or just a text message, and then I will read in the chat box. Antonio.
I don't have a question, sorry. But yeah, type them into the chat if you have a question, or raise your hand. Thanks.
Okay. I have one question, if you don't mind. Alina?
Hi. It was a really interesting talk in terms of really focusing on, I guess, how patients are different to each other, and that preference, and trying to bring that together into one outcome. Am I getting this right in terms of the trial setting? You pair the patients, so you almost select one from the treatment and one from the control, and then do the comparison. Is it a case of just randomly selecting that?
Yeah, the way that we trying to do here is at baseline, we can ask their preference. And of course, you have a baseline variable. And then during the trial, we don't ask them. So we use baseline ranking to determine what their outcome should be, right? So the NIH one is slightly different for the migraine study. So their idea here is they allow, because they randomize the patients to treatment arm and control arm, right? But the disease onset may be later. They may have migraine later. So before they take the pill, they ask patients which one is most bothersome. So if they had nausea and headache, and then they will rank nausea as the one, and then they take medication. So that one, before they actually receive intervention, they get preference. So we can do the same thing, but depends on, so the key point here is before intervention, they need to define which is their ranking. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And then is it a case of comparing those that have ranked them similarly?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Have you also had a look into if maybe some of the outcomes are missing? What you then do with that rank?
Yeah, right now we don't have missing data because we did survey, we did simulation. Missing data, one way to do that is treat as tie because we really don't know. So like survival case, right? So you have a sensory, both are censored. So you really can tell based on follow-up time. So you can only do is make them tied at 0.05. So the missing data can be approached this way. We haven't studied if we do the multiple imputation, what will be the results. Partially, I'm not quite understand if there's a different preference. Is that imputation need to put preference into the consideration? And so I haven't really dig into that. My sense is because of with new information there, it may be slightly different or more unstable, but we haven't done that.
No, thank you. That's really interesting. I guess it might also depend on maybe reasoning for missing data, if it's random or there might be some other reasons behind that. But it's super interesting. Thank you for answering my questions.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions colleagues have? Okay, I have a question, Professor Lu. Is this kind of a method or can be only applied for the medical condition where it's declining over the time, or can be some disease where it can be recovery at some stage?
It can be both. It should be fine. So we don't know how stable the preference is. That's something we are doing now, the second phase of the survey, trying to understand whether the preference stabilized or it's changing depending on disease time. For the trial, it can be getting worse, right? So the trial does not necessarily improve. So that way, but the trial is relatively easy because you have a time to start before intervention. So you can have a beginning point for select preference. For epidemiology data, it's much difficult because it may be because this progress of this area, therefore they rank this more important to them, right? So there's reverse causality there. And we don't know yet how to deal with that. We did cross-sectional, we see this disease onset because the ALS patient always progress, but they may be stabilized, right? So that you can reflect their. So you really the question here is that if longitudinally they change their preference in epidemiology data, how do we rank that patient, right? That one we haven't really solved that.
Yeah, this is what I thought as well, because for some diseases they may be the status is changing over the time, and so that preference could be dramatically changing. But for this kind of LS or AD, such as that only progression on the worst side, so it could be need to make it simpler. But I believe your team will further exploring that when the longitudinal data is available.
Yeah. So one way to imagine that, if I have two longitudinal time point, right? So ignoring the missing data, if suppose everyone follows through the time, then I can get the ranking at the baseline for each patient in the population and ranking in the follow-up in the population, right? So somebody maybe get worse progress, so their ranking reduced, versus somebody stable and their ranking improved. Or they get better, then their ranking really raised. So that way is one possible way to do that, you know, the compare the ranking over time. It's a little bit tricky because that means nobody get lost to the follow-up, right? You have the same population and they're by itself introduce a lot of bias. So clinical trial, again, we talk about clinical trial to start, but when you get into epidemiology data, it's really much harder and more questions to be answered.
Yeah, will be. Okay, thank you, Professor Lu. Any other questions from colleagues? Okay, well, let's thanks Professor Lu from the Stanford University in the USA for this fantastic seminar introducing this comparison endpoint for the clinical trial. And also, it's a thank you, colleague, for your time. And this is our first seminar in the RSS in Manchester local group. Welcome to listen or follow our future seminar series. Thanks a lot. Thank you for everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lu. Thank you.